Imagine you are ExxonMobil, a beast among oil companies in the 90s. Your power and influence span the globe, but your American roots sometimes put you at odds with U.S. foreign policy. The whims of American politics can turn your profitable business partnerships with certain foreign leaders or governments into a precarious situation overnight. You have had to watch as deals you thought were solid crumble beneath your feet, as your partners fall out of favor with the U.S. government. You have grown tired of this game of chance, this pesky inconvenience that threatens your bottom line. You have a solution: become a force so great, so powerful, that you are on par with an actual government or sovereign nation. It won't be easy, but you are willing to do whatever it takes to secure your place as one of the most dominant entities on the planet. ExxonMobil, once just a humble oil company, has transformed into a private empire with its own foreign policy and climate agenda. With a pseudo-embassy that attracts world leaders, ExxonMobil has become a force to be reckoned with in the global oil supply chain. Some say that the company has become so powerful that it can determine the fate of entire nations, even influencing American foreign policy. It's a remarkable story of how a single company, under the vision of one of history's greatest businessmen, John D Rockefeller, can rise to challenge entire nation-states. The rise of this private empire is a fascinating tale, one that illustrates the true power that corporations can wield in today's world. It all started in 1870 when John D Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Company, marking the beginning of America's oil rush. From the outset, Rockefeller had his sights set on controlling as much of the market as possible. However, in 1911, the U.S. government decided that Standard Oil had become too dominant and declared it a monopoly. The company was subsequently broken up into 34 smaller entities. This could have been a disaster for Rockefeller, but he was a savvy businessman. He had shares in almost every one of those 34 businesses, and eventually made even more money than he would have if Standard Oil had survived. It was merely the start of a new chapter in the story of one of the greatest businessmen of all time. Exxon and Mobil, two of the most prominent descendants of Standard Oil, had a fierce rivalry that lasted for decades, but in 1998, they decided to merge in an attempt to recreate the old days as an almost monopoly on American oil by merging the two greatest companies of Standard Oil. ExxonMobil quickly rose to become one of the largest corporations in the world, boasting impressive revenue and market capitalization. However, there was one small but significant detail that threatened to undermine their position: the limited supply of oil. The story of ExxonMobil after the 1973 oil crisis is one of navigating the complex web of global politics and oil supply. With their strong ties to the Middle East, Exxon had been able to secure a steady supply of oil for decades, even going as far as funding wars in exchange for oil concessions. However, as the oil embargo and shifting political landscapes in the Middle East disrupted these relationships, Exxon had to find new sources of oil quickly. Their strategy was to offer massive cash payments to oil-producing countries in exchange for oil rights, but they soon found themselves outcompeted by countries like China and Russia, who could offer more significant geopolitical favors, weapons sales, and loans. For ExxonMobil, the quest for oil would prove to be a never-ending battle against powerful forces beyond their control. ExxonMobil ranked 14th among the world's largest oil companies in the late 90s, trailing behind Aramco in Saudi Arabia and Gazprom in Russia, but aimed to reach the top. To achieve this, the company, along with BP and Royal Dutch Shell, took advantage of the instability during the Iraq War and moved its operations into the country. The priority was to extract as much oil as possible, regardless of the impact on the Iraqi people, until the country stabilized. ExxonMobil was on the rise and presented fresh opportunities to enact distinct global policies. U.S. politics hinders global goals unless one has significant power or a connection to the White House. Over the next 2 decades, ExxonMobil had both, starting with the election of oil-friendly President George Bush in 2001. ExxonMobil and other oil companies donated $1.5 million to Bush's campaign, the largest donation ever given to a candidate. Once inaugurated, Bush was in a position to return the favor to the oil industry. ExxonMobil wielded significant power and access to the White House, with the company's representatives frequently receiving meetings upon request. Rather than asking for specific favors, ExxonMobil used its influence to gather information. Concealed to lawmakers, this intel would ultimately help the company establish its oil empire with its unique foreign policy, much like a sovereign state. One of the earliest bold political moves made by ExxonMobil was to confront Hugo Chavez and his government in Venezuela. The relationship between the two parties had been long-standing, but when Chavez came into power, he made the sudden decision to nationalize the country's oil industry. This meant that private companies like ExxonMobil would lose control of their operations, which was a nightmare for them. Instead of giving in to Chavez's demands, ExxonMobil took the matter to the World Bank. The outcome was in their favor, and the US government also supported their claim. Over the years, ExxonMobil was able to obtain over $16 billion from Venezuela, even as the country sank into poverty. Despite the ongoing economic crisis, ExxonMobil persisted in its quest for more money, requesting an additional $1.6 billion in 2014. As of today, the average income in Venezuela is just $53, highlighting the extent of the country's economic struggles. In Chad, ExxonMobil took a more diplomatic approach. The company arrived during a time when the country was struggling. ExxonMobil came to the rescue, offering the prospect of economic freedom and development in exchange for oil. The government of Chad was in dire need of money to build essential public services such as healthcare and education, and oil seemed like the only valuable asset they could offer. Initially, the agreement seemed like a fair trade, but ExxonMobil managed to slip a clause into the contract without the Chadian government noticing. Article 34 of the contract stated that no one, including the future governments of Chad, could change the agreement without ExxonMobil's permission. This gave the company absolute control over its operations in the country. Until today, ExxonMobil continues to operate in Chad, one of the poorest countries in the world. Despite the promises of development and infrastructure, most Chadians still lack access to necessities such as food, water, and housing, and medical facilities are scarce, with only one doctor per 38,000 people. Like US foreign policy, ExxonMobil has made it a habit of promising extraordinary growth and development, only to abandon those promises once they have secured their desired outcome. ExxonMobil's deals in other countries could be justified as the cutthroat nature of business, but their involvement in the conflict in Indonesia crossed ethical boundaries. Between 1976 and 2005, rebels fought against the Indonesian army to gain independence for the province of Aceh, where the Arun gas fields were located, which Mobil and later ExxonMobil operated. During the conflict, ExxonMobil hired military units from the Indonesian army to protect their facilities, effectively creating their own private army. They argued that their decision to hire military units from the Indonesian army was necessary to ensure the safety of their employees. However, they failed to acknowledge that the same military units were committing severe human rights violations against the local population. Moreover, the funds provided by ExxonMobil to these units were used to purchase weapons and expand their ranks. ExxonMobil maintained that they were unaware of the violations and that their main priority was to continue their business operations. ExxonMobil was sued in 2000 and won by 11 villagers for their complicity in human rights abuses. They sold their operations to another company in 2015, but litigation was still ongoing as of 2017. At this crucial moment, ExxonMobil realized that obtaining serious influence within the White House is imperative to keep yourself out of hot water. The fortunes turn when Donald Trump assumes the presidency and appoints Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. As luck would have it, Tillerson had been with Exxon since 1975 and worked his way up to become the company's chairman and CEO in 2006. He actively fought against a regulation that would have compelled ExxonMobil to reveal its payments to foreign governments. Then, in 2017, just an hour before his confirmation as Secretary of State, that regulation was canceled. Tillerson was a true company man, and at last, the company now had a devoted ally on the inside. For 42 long years, Equatorial Guinea was ruled by a dictator who showed no regard for his people, leaving over 70% of the population living in poverty. Yet, he and his family lived in opulence, owning houses in Malibu, a collection of Michael Jackson memorabilia, and no fewer than 6 rare supercars. The question is, where did all that wealth come from? The answer, unsurprisingly, is Exxon. Just like the US government, if a dictator is good for business, turning a blind eye is not out of the question. In Equatorial Guinea, the ruling family controls everything, and when companies pay for the right to extract oil, the money is deposited directly into the family's bank account in Washington. This only highlights the fact that for some, no foreign policy is as crucial as that of the United States of ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil's history of reckless support for wars and dictators is finally catching up with them. Their investment rating has been downgraded to AA, which is far from ideal. On top of this, they are currently under investigation by multiple attorney generals and are facing allegations of misleading investors. Despite all these challenges, ExxonMobil continues to abide by its motto of "No one likes us, but we don't care." It remains to be seen how the company will weather this storm and what its future holds. This is how Exxon became known as one of the most hated businesses in history.